Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's both timely and, let's be honest, a bit mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Floods in the Sahara Desert,
Wow.
and how some are linking them to biblical prophecy.
It's certainly a fascinating intersection of current events and those ancient texts.
We have a video you shared that dives into this,
Right.
claiming these floods aren't just a freak weather event, but potentially signs of things to come, as foretold in the Bible.
Interesting.
Before we get into the specific verses, though, can you give us a quick rundown on these Sahara floods?
Sure.
Most people think of the Sahara as like the ultimate dry expanse.
Exactly. And that's what makes these floods so striking.
Yeah.
We've seen unusual and heavy rains in parts of the Sahara, leading to, well, actual flooding in a place known for its aridity.
Okay, so not just a drizzle.
No.
We're talking serious rainfall here,
Right.
enough to create temporary lakes and oases.
Yes.
And this is where the connection to climate change comes in. It's a stark illustration of how weather patterns are being disrupted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. So the setting for these biblical interpretations is pretty dramatic in itself.
Yeah.
Now, this video throws out a bunch of Bible verses as being relevant. Where should we even start with unpacking this?
Well, many of the verses cited focus on the idea of desert transformation,
Okay.
which visually aligns with the idea of the Sahara blooming after these floods.
Right.
Isaiah 35.1 is a key example, talking about the desert rejoicing and blossoming,
Okay.
like the crocus.
Blossoming like the crocus. That's
Yeah.
such vivid imagery.
It is.
But Isaiah was writing thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
What did this kind of blossoming signify to his original audience?
Well, to those living in a largely arid region, the blossoming of the crocus was a sign of hope and renewal.
Right.
It represented the coming of spring after a harsh winter, a time of abundance following scarcity.
Yeah.
So applying this to the Sahara, it's not just about literal flowers. It's about the unexpected emergence of life in a place where it seems impossible.
So a sign of radical change, a reversal of expectations.
Yeah.
That does make the connection to these floods a bit more nuanced than just desert equals water now.
Precisely. And this theme of dramatic reversal is echoed in other verses cited,
Okay.
like Ezekiel 47.8-9.
Okay.
This passage describes life-giving waters flowing through the Arabah,
Right.
which was a desert area stretching down into what we know as the Sahara.
Okay. For those of us not up on our biblical geography, what exactly was the Arabah?
It was essentially a desolate region, known for its harshness and lack of life.
Okay.
And Ezekiel's prophecy speaks of it being transformed by these waters,
Right.
turning barrenness into abundance.
So again, we have this image of life springing forth in the most unlikely of places.
Right.
But hold on, doesn't the Bible also say that God promised never to flood the earth again after Noah's Ark?
Yes, you're referring to Genesis 9.1.
Yeah.
But it's important to distinguish between a global flood, like the one described in Genesis, and localized floods, like those in the Sahara.
Right.
Theologically, many interpret God's promise as referring to a cataclysmic, world-ending flood.
Okay, so these localized floods could be seen as distinct events,
Yeah,
perhaps even serving a different purpose.
that's one way to look at it.
Okay.
Some see them as potential signs or warnings,
Right.
prompts for introspection rather than instruments of total destruction.
That makes sense.
Okay.
So moving on, the video also mentions Matthew 24.7-8, which talks about famines, earthquakes,
Right.
and the beginning of birth pains.
Yeah.
How does this fit into the discussion about the Sahara floods?
Well, this passage speaks to a larger context of global upheaval and change,
Okay.
events that are disruptive and potentially painful.
Yeah.
Some interpret climate change and natural disasters like these floods as part of this larger pattern of instability. The birth pains preceding a significant shift.
So not just a one-off event, but possibly part of a much larger unfolding story.
Exactly. And this leads us to a group of verses that connect water with transformation,
Okay.
but specifically transformation as a form of judgment.
Okay.
One example is Revelation 16.4, where an angel pours out a bowl, turning waters bitter.
Whoa, that's a pretty intense image.
It is.
So we're shifting from life-giving water to something potentially harmful.
Yes, and this duality of water is something that runs throughout Scripture.
Right.
It can represent both life and judgment,
Got it.
depending on the context.
Okay, so water isn't always a positive symbol.
Right.
I'm seeing how this connects to the Sahara floods.
Yeah.
They could be seen as a blessing to some,
Right.
but also a potential harbinger of something more unsettling.
That's one interpretation, yes.
That's a pretty profound question to ponder.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground already,
We have.
and it seems like there's a lot more to unpack.
There is.
Before we go any further, can you give us a quick recap of the key takeaways so far?
Absolutely. We've seen verses that speak of desert transformation, turning barrenness into abundance.
Okay.
We've explored the symbolism of water as both a life-giving force and a potential instrument of judgment.
Yeah.
And we've touched on the idea that these floods could be part of a larger pattern of global change,
Right.
potentially signifying a time of upheaval and transition.
Wow. Yeah, we've gone from a seemingly simple news event to some pretty deep theological territory.
We have.
Ready to dive into some more verses.
Absolutely. There are still quite a few passages in this video that offer unique perspectives on this phenomenon.
Okay, I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
What comes next in this exploration of biblical prophecy and the Sahara floods?
Let's look at some verses that offer a more hopeful interpretation, connecting the floods to the idea of spiritual renewal and God's power to create something new, even in the most unexpected places.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
Oh.
What verses are we talking about here?
Well, one that stands out is Isaiah 41.18. It talks about God making rivers flow on barren heights. Imagine the visual of those temporary lakes and oases forming in the Sahara.
Right.
It's almost as if the desert is being momentarily transformed, just like the verse describes.
Yeah, I can definitely see the connection there. It's like a visual echo of that ancient prophecy.
It is.
What other verses fit into this theme of renewal and hope?
John 7.38 is another one.
Okay.
Here, Jesus talks about rivers of living water flowing from believers.
Okay, but that's a metaphor, right?
Yes.
Rivers of living water representing spiritual truth and nourishment.
Correct. But some see a connection between this spiritual outpouring and the physical floods in the Sahara.
Okay.
It's like the floods are a prompt for us to consider our own spiritual state,
Interesting.
our own thirst for something beyond the material world.
So the physical event might be a catalyst for inner reflection and a search for deeper meaning.
Exactly.
Okay.
It encourages us to ask, what are we truly thirsty for? And where do we find the living water that can quench that thirst?
That's a pretty powerful question to be asking ourselves, especially in the midst of all this global change.
It is.
What other verses point to this idea of spiritual renewal?
Well, there's Isaiah 43.9a,
Okay.
which talks about God doing a new thing,
Mm.
making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland.
Yeah, I can see how that connects to the Sahara.
Yeah.
It's a place that seems like a wasteland,
Well-
but then, boom, these floods come and create something unexpected, like a miracle.
It speaks to God's power to transform seemingly impossible situations,
Yeah.
bringing life and hope to places that seem barren and desolate.
It's a message that resonates on multiple levels, from the literal transformation of the desert to the potential for spiritual renewal in our own lives.
Precisely.
And this theme of transformation extends even further when we look at verses that connect physical changes in the world to a larger cosmic plan.
It does.
Okay, now we're getting into some really big picture stuff. What verses are you thinking of here?
Well, Luke 21.25-26 comes to mind.
Okay.
This passage talks about signs in the sun, moon, and stars,
Right.
and the anguish of nations.
I remember that passage.
Yeah,
That's pretty dramatic stuff.
it is.
But how do people connect it to the Sahara floods?
Well, some interpret these extreme climate changes, including the floods, as part of a larger pattern of signs pointing to a significant shift in the world.
Okay, so it's not just about a change in weather,
Yeah.
but potentially a change in the very fabric of reality.
That's one interpretation, yes.
Wow.
It raises the question, are we witnessing the beginning of something bigger, something that transcends our current understanding of the world?
That's a pretty mind-blowing thought.
It is.
It definitely makes these floods seem a lot more significant than just a random weather event.
Yeah.
Are there any other verses that tie into this idea of cosmic change and potential judgment?
There are a few.
Okay.
One that stands out is Revelation 8.1-11,
Okay.
which describes a falling star called wormwood
Right.
that turns waters bitter.
Okay, another image of water being transformed,
Yeah.
but this time in a negative way.
Yeah.
So we're back to that duality of water representing both life and judgment.
Exactly. And this passage, although describing a different event, reinforces the idea that changes in water especially dramatic and unexpected changes, can be symbolic of larger shifts and judgments.
It's like a recurring motif in these prophecies.
It is.
Water can bring life and abundance,
Right.
but it can also be a force of destruction and purification.
Exactly.
And that ambiguity is something to keep in mind as we explore these verses and try to discern their potential meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these seemingly disparate verses can be woven together to create a tapestry of meaning.
Yeah.
With different threads representing hope, judgment, renewal,
Yeah,
and transformation.
absolutely.
What other threads are there in this tapestry?
Well, we focus a lot on the potentially negative interpretations.
Right.
But there are also verses that offer a more positive outlook,
Okay.
connecting the floods to the idea of abundance and blessing.
Okay, I'm ready for a little more hope and a little less doom and gloom.
All right.
What verses are you thinking of?
Well, Joel 2:23-24 comes to mind.
Okay.
It talks about abundant rain bringing forth life and prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful image,
It is.
and it connects to the visual of the Sahara blooming after the floods, even if that blooming is temporary.
Yeah, so even amidst potential warnings and judgments,
Yeah.
there's also this thread of hope and renewal,
Right.
the promise of blessings and abundance.
Yes, and that's an important element to keep in mind as we navigate these complex prophecies. It's not always about choosing one interpretation over another.
Right.
Sometimes it's about holding both the positive and the negative in tension,
Okay.
recognizing that both might be at play.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like we're looking at a multifaceted gem,
Yes.
and each facet reflects a different aspect of truth. What other facets are there to explore?
Let's look at a verse that connects the symbolism of water to the concept of justice and righteousness.
Okay, now we're getting into some interesting territory.
We are
What verse are you referring to?
Amos 5.24.
Okay.
It describes justice rolling on like a river and righteousness, like a never-failing stream.
Oh, okay. So water as a symbol of something pure and cleansing,
Right.
something that brings order and fairness.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And some interpret the Sahara floods as a propential manifestation of this divine justice,
Okay.
a reminder that God's ways are ultimately righteous, even if they seem unpredictable or disruptive.
Okay, so the interpretation can swing both ways,
It could.
towards hope and abundance
Yeah.
or towards judgment and righteousness.
Right.
It's fascinating how these verses can be read on multiple levels depending on your perspective.
That's the beauty and the challenge of biblical interpretation.
Yeah.
It invites us to engage deeply with the text and to consider different perspectives, recognizing that there might not always be one definitive answer.
It's like these verses are mirrors reflecting our own hopes and fears, our own beliefs and doubts.
Yeah,
What we see in them depends on where we're standing, so to speak.
that's a great way to put it. It reminds us that interpretation is never entirely objective.
Right.
It's always influenced by our own experiences, our own ways of seeing the world.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into some more verses and see what other reflections we can find.
Right.
What's next on our biblical tour?
Let's explore a few verses that connect the idea of physical transformation with the concept of spiritual renewal.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
How do these two concepts intersect?
Well, one passage that comes to mind is Isaiah 32.15.
Okay.
It talks about the Spirit being poured out from on high, transforming the desert into a fertile field.
I see the connection to the Sahara.
Yeah,
It's like the floods are a physical manifestation of that spiritual outpouring,
exactly.
bringing new life to a barren place.
And this verse emphasizes the connection between spiritual renewal and physical transformation.
Okay.
The desert blooming can be seen as a metaphor for the flourishing that occurs when God's Spirit is at work.
So it's not just about the physical changes, but about what those changes might represent on a deeper level.
Precisely.
Okay.
It encourages us to look beyond the surface and consider the spiritual implications of these events.
Interesting.
Are these floods a sign of a spiritual awakening, a reconnection to the divine?
That's a profound question to ask.
It is.
And it brings us back to the idea that these floods might be more than just a random weather event.
Right.
They could be a sign, a message, a wake-up call.
Yeah,
But the interpretation is still up for debate.
that's right.
We've explored verses that point towards hope and renewal, while others suggest judgment and a call for righteousness.
Right.
And as we delve further into the remaining verses, we'll see that this tension between hope and warning continues to play out in fascinating ways.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring.
What other verses are waiting to be unpacked?
Let's look at a few that paint even more vivid pictures of transformation and restoration,
Okay.
offering glimpses of what might lie ahead,
Yeah.
both for the earth and for humanity.
I'm all ears.
Okay.
What verses are you thinking of?
Well, one that stands out is Ezekiel 36.35.
Okay.
It describes a desolate land becoming like the Garden of Eden.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful image.
It is.
From a desolate wasteland to a paradise of abundance.
Right.
That's quite a transformation.
It is. And this vision of restoration is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It suggests that even the most damaged and broken places can be made new again, reflecting the transformative power of God's grace.
It's like a glimpse of ultimate healing and renewal,
It is.
both for the earth and for humanity.
Yeah.
And this connects back to the Sahara floods, right?
It does.
A place that seems so barren and lifeless,
Right.
suddenly bursting forth with new life,
Exactly.
like a miracle.
It invites us to consider, could these floods be a foreshadowing of a larger restoration still to come?
Right.
A small taste of the abundance and beauty that God intends for creation.
That's a really hopeful thought.
It is.
But I also remember some of the verses we discussed earlier about judgment and the potential for things to get worse before they get better.
You're right. And as we move towards the final verses in this video, we'll see that this tension between hope and warning, between promise and judgment, continues to be a central theme.
Okay, I'm ready to explore that tension further.
Okay.
What verses are next on our list?
Well, one that offers a word of caution amidst all this talk of transformation and renewal is 2 Peter 3.1.
Okay, what does 2 Peter 3.1 say?
It warns that the day of the Lord will come like a thief,
Right.
reminding us that signs of restoration might also be precursors to even more significant events.
So we should be paying attention,
Yes.
but also keeping things in perspective.
Yeah.
These events could be part of a much larger story unfolding, one that might have both positive and negative aspects.
Exactly. It's a reminder to stay vigilant and to seek understanding in the midst of these potentially momentous times.
Right.
And it leads us to a group of verses that focus on the idea of creation itself being in a state of change,
Okay.
even turmoil.
Okay, now we're getting into some really interesting territory.
We are.
What verses are you referring to?
Well, Romans 8.22 comes to mind.
Okay.
It talks about creation groaning, as if in pain.
And how does that tie into the Sahara floods?
Well, some believe that extreme climate changes, like these floods, could be a manifestation of this groaning, a sign that creation itself is longing for restoration and renewal.
So even the earth is crying out for change in a way. It's like the planet is going through its own birth pains.
Yeah.
Just like those mentioned in Matthew 24.
That's one interpretation, yes.
It invites us to consider our role in caring for creation and to recognize the interconnectedness of all things. What happens in one part of the world, even in a seemingly remote place like the Sahara, can have ripple effects that touch us all.
Can.
It's a reminder that we are not just passive observers of these events, but active participants in the story that's unfolding.
Exactly. And our choices, our actions, our responses to these events all play a part in shaping the future.
Okay, I'm ready to explore this idea of active participation a bit further.
Right.
What other verses speak to this theme?
Let's look at a couple that connect the Sahara floods to the idea of God's ultimate plan for creation.
Okay.
A plan that encompasses both restoration and renewal,
Okay.
but also judgment and purification.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
All right.
What verses are we talking about here?
Well, one that offers a glimpse of this ultimate plan is Revelation 22.1-2.
What does this passage describe?
It describes a river of the water of life
Okay.
flowing from the throne of God.
Okay.
It speaks to the ultimate source of life and healing.
Mm-hmm.
And some see the Sahara floods as a small earthly echo of this divine abundance.
So it's like a little taste of what's to come.
Yes.
A reminder of God's power to transform and restore even the most unlikely of places.
Exactly. It encourages us to look beyond the immediate challenges and to focus on the ultimate hope that God offers.
Right?
And this leads us to the final verse we'll be discussing in this deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
All right.
What's the last verse on our list?
1 Thessalonians 5.2-3.
Okay.
This verse talks about the sudden arrival of the day of the Lord,
Right.
a time of judgment and reckoning.
And how does this connect to the Sahara floods?
Well, the video suggests that the sudden and unexpected nature of the floods is a reminder that the day of the Lord could come just as unexpectedly.
Okay, so it's a wake-up call.
It is.
A reminder to be prepared for the unexpected,
Yes.
to live each day with intention and purpose.
Precisely.
Okay.
It encourages us to live with a sense of urgency and purpose,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that we are living in a time of great potential significance.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
That was quite a biblical journey.
It was.
Before we move on,
Sure.
can you give us a quick recap of the main themes we've explored so far?
Absolutely. We've seen verses that speak of desert transformation,
Mm-hmm.
turning barrenness into abundance.
Right.
We've explored the symbolism of water as both a life-giving force and a potential instrument of judgment.
Yeah.
We've touched on the idea that these floods could be part of a larger pattern of global change,
Mm-hmm.
potentially signifying a time of upheaval and transition.
Right.
We've seen verses that connect the floods to the idea of spiritual renewal and
Yeah.
God's power to create something new, even in the most unexpected places.
Okay.
We've looked at passages that link the floods to the concept of divine justice and righteousness.
Right.
And finally, we've explored the idea that these floods might be a foreshadowing of a larger restoration still to come,
Mm-hmm.
a small taste of the abundance and beauty that God intends for creation,
Okay.
while also acknowledging the possibility of judgment and the need to be prepared for the unexpected.
That's quite a list.
It is.
And it's amazing how these verses from thousands of years ago can feel so relevant to what's happening in the world today.
It is.
What I'm taking away from all of this is that these floods in the Sahara could be more than just a random weather event.
Right.
They could be a sign, a message, a wake-up call.
Yeah.
But the interpretation is up for debate.
It is.
Some see it as a sign of hope and restoration,
Mm-hmm.
while others see it as a warning of judgment.
Right.
And it seems like there are even more nuances and layers to explore.
There are?
That's a great summary.
Okay.
And you're right,
Mm.
there are more threads to unravel in this tapestry of biblical prophecy and modern-day events.
Absolutely.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into a few more verses from the video and explore the implications of these different interpretations,
We will.
asking what they might mean for us personally and collectively as we navigate these times of change and uncertainty. Okay, we'll take a quick break, but we'll be back soon to continue unpacking these fascinating biblical connections to the Sahara floods.
Okay.
Stay with us.
Yeah, that's good.
We're back, and I'm still pondering that tension. We were just talking about the Sahara floods as both a potential blessing and a warning.
Yeah.
It's making my head spin a little, honestly.
It is a lot to consider, isn't it? This video doesn't shy away from that complexity. It throws out even more verses that touch on how individuals should respond in times like these, which I find particularly interesting.
Okay, so less about decoding the event itself and more about what now for those who see it through this biblical lens.
Exactly. One that jumped out at me was Isaiah 35.5-6, where it talks about the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, and the lame leaping.
Right.
It's this incredible image of restoration and healing.
But how does that relate to, actual floods in a desert? Is it just a general God can do anything kind of message?
It can be seen that way, yes, but there's also a connection to the idea that the blooming desert, this sudden burst of life, could be a foreshadowing of that larger ultimate restoration God promises.
Right.
Almost like a mini miracle pointing to a bigger one still to come.
So for those who believe in this prophetic interpretation, the floods aren't just a cool natural phenomenon. They're a glimpse of God's power at work on a grand scale.
That's one way to view it, yes. It encourages a shift in perspective from seeing these events as isolated occurrences to viewing them as potentially connected to a larger divine narrative.
Okay, so it's not just about the Sahara. It's about God's plan for, everything.
Precisely. And that leads us to a verse that directly addresses God's intention for the whole of creation. Ephesians 1 point near. It talks about God's purpose to bring all things both in heaven and on earth under Christ's rule.
Okay, that's a big concept. How do people connect that to, climate change and floods?
Well, some see these changes in nature, including the Sahara floods, as part of this grand unifying process. Maybe not the end goal, but a step towards everything being brought together under God's will.
So for those following this line of thinking the floods aren't random, they're intentional part of this larger cosmic plan unfolding.
That's a possible interpretation, yes. It encourages us to zoom OUT to see these events in a broader context. It's not just about deserts blooming, but about the entire universe ultimately aligning with God's purpose.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. And speaking of big ideas, the video then brings up 2 Chronicles 7.14. That one's pretty well known, right?
It is, especially among those who believe in the power of prayer. The verse offers a conditional promise. If God's people humble themselves, pray, seek his face, and turn from wickedness, Then he'll heal their land.
So how does that connect to the Sahara floods? Are people saying prayer caused the rain?
Not necessarily directly, but some might see these events as a call to action, a prompt for people to, well, do exactly what the verse says. Humble themselves, pray, seek God, and change their ways. Especially in a time of global uncertainty, this verse resonates with those seeking answers and guidance.
So instead of debating whether the floods are good or bad, the focus shifts to how we should respond individually and as a community.
That's certainly one application of this verse, yes. It highlights the importance of personal response in the face of potentially significant events. It's not just about observing, it's about participating and engaging with our faith.
Okay, so action over analysis in a way. What's the last verse this video highlights as a call to action?
It's a short but powerful one, Hebrews 3:15. It's a plea to not harden our hearts when we hear God's voice, especially today.
So the idea is that these floods, regardless of their specific meaning, are a way for God to get our attention, like a cosmic knock on the door.
That's one way to interpret it, yes. It's a cautionary note urging us to be receptive rather than dismissive, to listen for God's message amidst the chaos and change.
Okay, so we've looked at a ton of verses, and it's clear there are many ways to interpret these Sahara floods through a biblical lens. It's a lot for our listeners to digest. What are some of the key takeaways you think are most important?
You're right, it's a lot, T. I think the most important thing is that these events invite us to engage with our OWN beliefs and values.
Yeah.
Whether you see the floods as hopeful or scary, they challenge us to think about our place in the world and our relationship with the divine.
It's like these floods are a giant question mark in the sand, forcing us to confront what we believe about the world and our place in it.
Exactly. How do we make sense of these events? What do they reveal about the state of our planet and the direction of human history? And most importantly, how should we respond? Those are the questions these verses prompt us to consider.
And it sounds like, regardless of your specific interpretation, the message is clear. These events are a call to action, to live with intention, to seek truth, to make choices aligned with our deepest values.
That's a powerful insight. These floods, whatever their ultimate meaning, are a stark reminder that we are living in dynamic times and our choices matter. They're not just a spectacle, they're a prompt for reflection, A&D action.
They remind us that we're not passive observers, but active participants in this unfolding story of humanity A&D creation.
Beautifully said. And that active participation requires discernment, wisdom, and a willingness to grapple with complex questions and diverse perspectives, which is exactly what we've been trying to do in this deep dive.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, and I feel like I need a moment to process everything we've discussed. But before we do that, are there any other biblical interpretations of the Sahara floods that we haven't touched on yet?
Yes, there are a few more threads to unravel in this tapestry of biblical prophecy and modern-day events. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some additional verses that offer unique perspectives on the significance of the Sahara floods and what they might portend for the future.
Okay, we'll be back soon to continue our exploration of these fascinating connections between the Sahara floods and the Bible. Stay tuned. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Sahara floods and all these biblical prophecies they seem to be echoing. It's been quite a journey.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it, to see how these ancient texts are being interpreted in light of, these very unusual events.
Definitely. And we've only just scratched the surface. There are still a few more verses that offer kind of unique perspectives on this whole phenomenon.
Right.
So before we wrap up, let's delve into those last few threads of biblical interpretation. What other passages are people pointing to?
Well, one that stood out to me was Isaiah 35:5 to 56:6. It speaks of healing and restoration, for the blind, the deaf, the lame.
Right.
A powerful image of God's power to make whole what is broken.
But how does that relate to actual floods in a desert? Is it just a general, God can do anything kind of message?
It can be seen that way, yes, but some see a deeper connection there. The blooming desert, with its sudden burst of life, it's almost like a glimpse of this larger restoration.
Okay.
A foreshadowing of God's ultimate plan to heal not only the earth, but also humanity.
So it's like a mini miracle in the desert pointing to a much grander miracle still to come.
That's one way to interpret it, yeah. It encourages us to see these events not just as isolated occurrences, but as potentially connected to a larger divine narrative.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these seemingly disparate verses, can be woven together to create a tapestry of meaning. What other threads are there in this tapestry?
Well, Ephesians 1:10 speaks of God's purpose to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ.
Okay, so how does that relate to the changes we're seeing in nature?
Well, one perspective is to view these changes, including the Sahara floods, as part of this grand plan, perhaps even as signs of this unifying process, unfolding.
So it's not just about deserts blooming, but about everything ultimately being brought together under God's purpose.
That's a possible interpretation, yes. It encourages us to kind of zoom OUT and see these events in a broader cosmic context.
Then there's 2 Chronicles 7.14, which we touched on earlier. It's a familiar passage, especially among those who believe in the power of prayer.
Yes, this verse offers a conditional promise. If God's people humble themselves, pray, seek his face, and turn from their wicked ways, then he will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land.
So how's that being connected to the Sahara floods? Are people suggesting that, prayer directly caused the rain?
Not necessarily directly, but some might see these events as a call to action, a prompt for people to heed this ancient advice and turn back to God, in a time of global uncertainty.
So instead of just debating the meaning of the floods, we should be focusing on, our own spiritual state and seeking God's guidance.
That's certainly one application of this verse, yes. It highlights the importance of personal response in the face of potentially significant events.
Okay, and the last verse we'll touch on is Hebrews 3.15. What message does this verse convey?
This passage is a plea. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. It emphasizes the need to be open to God's message, especially in times of change and upheaval.
So it's kind of a cautionary note, urging us to pay attention and not dismiss what might be important messages from God.
Exactly. It encourages a posture of humility and receptivity, rather than one of skepticism or denial.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring various interpretations of the Sahara floods through the lens of biblical prophecy. Some see it as a sign of hope and restoration, others as a warning of judgment, and some see it as a call to action, urging us to examine our own lives and turn towards God. It's a lot to process.
It is, and I think the most important takeaway is that these events, regardless of how we interpret them, they really challenge us to engage with our own beliefs and values.
Right.
They push us to ask ourselves, what do I believe about the world?
Yeah.
What is my relationship with God? And how should I live my life in light of what's happening around me?
It's like these floods are holding up a mirror to humanity, forcing us to ask some tough questions about ourselves and our future.
Precisely. They invite us to consider our priorities, our values, and our hopes for the future.
And whether you see these events as a sign of hope or a warning of judgment, it seems like the message is clear. We need to be paying attention. We need to be aware of the changes happening around us and consider what they might mean, both personally and globally.
I agree. These floods in the Sahara, a place that seems so far removed from our everyday lives, they have the power to ripple outward, prompting us to re-examine our priorities and to seek a deeper understanding of the world and our place within it.
It's a reminder that even in the most unexpected places, we can find signs, messages, and glimpses of something greater than ourselves.
Absolutely. And those signs, however we interpret them, can guide us toward a more meaningful and purposeful life.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Sahara Desert floods and the biblical prophecies they seem to be echoing. I hope this exploration has been as thought-provoking for you as it has been for us.
We've only scratched the surface of this topic, but hopefully we've provided you with some food for thought and some new perspectives to consider.
And as always, we encourage you to continue your own exploration. Read the scriptures for yourself, research the topic further, and most importantly, reflect on what these events mean to you personally, because ultimately the most important interpretations are the ones we form within our own hearts and minds.
Well said. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking truth wherever it may lead.